we're talking about emails today. And in fact, we're teaching a template today. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. We are going to dig into this template today. Oh, and I forgot to give you this because in my sugar craze, this will be ready to share out right away. And that's for you. Okay, you're seeing my screen, how to write, either that or you're seeing my Slack. So hopefully you're seeing my PowerPoint, my Google Sheets. Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, cool. So we're talking about how to write a lead nurturing email, but this can also be used to nurture trial users because we're going to try to get our prospect to early product awareness before the end of the email. So this is meant for a lead who maybe doesn't understand the value of your product yet. They want to because they've signed up. They're interested in your category. They want something to do with your solution, but they haven't yet purchased, given you money for the solution. In some cases, this could be used if this was for a brand new user to try to get them to activate in your software or in whatever it is that you're selling. I don't know about for e-commerce, unless it's like beyond clothing e-commerce. Nonetheless, we're going to focus on lead and trial nurturing here. I'm going to talk about leads throughout, but just know that you can also use this for trials. All right, cool. So here's the finished email. You don't have to be able to read it. Don't worry, we're going to move through this and I'll share it with you as we go. So you'll see the template and then you'll see how that looks in the actual email itself, the finished one that is like the example of this email in use. So this was originally designed and written for a SaaS business called Get Prime, which I loved. Get Prime was one of my favorite clients of all time, if not my very favorite client of all time. Then they sold to Pluralsight. So they did great stuff. They grew really fast. I like to think these emails had something to do with that. But here, the idea was for leads, we wanted to move them from problem aware to early product aware so that we could keep building up that product awareness. Because as we know, and if you don't know, cool, watch other Tutorial Tuesdays or go through Copy School. But stages of awareness, not going to get into them, but it is a spectrum. And we want people to get to the far end of the spectrum where they can then buy confidently and be less likely to churn out. Okay, so we want to move problem aware leads to early product aware before the end of the email. That means going over problem, solution, and then into product, which is a doable thing, but that's why the email is going to be a little longer than you might be used to, especially if you're in SaaS or e-commerce as well. Service businesses, programs, masterminds, they're used to longer emails. And in fact, an email like this would be like kind of weird for service businesses, but give it a shot. You can format it in different ways that make sense for you. Okay, so we're going to reference this email as we go through to give you an example of what it should look like. Now, what you're going to need for this to work. If you're watching this right now live, then you might not have all of these things in place, and that's cool. You can go back and watch the replay and do your best to work through the template today. And this is a working session, so I do want you to jump on in there. What you're going to need is a feature or a product you want to sell your leads on. And when I have feature in quotation marks, that means like if you are a service, you're probably not thinking in terms of features, but there are features of what your service actually provides. And those features might be team members, unique processes, things like that. So you want to sell your leads on this thing. It's typically a thing that will move them to say yes to you, but don't overthink it. Just grab a feature or a product you want to sell your leads on. And if you're just selling like SaaS, then you should have features. So that should be pretty easy. You want a value prop for that feature or product. Don't overthink a value prop. It really is just a statement of the value that they can expect to get from it. We can get deeper into what a value prop is, and there's nuance there to make it better and better, but you're really just saying like, what does this feature do? What's the value? What's the outcome that you can expect to get from it? Then the problem, which we're going to call the hard thing. This was originally made for SaaS companies, software as a service companies, to write their trial nurture emails. And so a really a great book is The Hard Thing About Hard Things. So the hard thing is a known thing inside the SaaS world, which is why we're calling the problem the hard thing here. So this problem that the feature or product solves for your customers or clients. And then you also want a sense for the solutions your prospect has tried that have failed them. So we're going to dig into all of this. Use this really directly on the page. You shouldn't need anything much outside of these things. And then you need the template. So hit this up. It's going to invite you to make a copy of it. Say yes to it. Just make a copy. Nothing bad will happen. It's Google, pretty safe, and we didn't do anything to it. So all you have to do is click make a copy. You'll get your own copy of this that you can then immediately go forward and edit. You don't have to worry about requesting permissions or anything like that. But if you don't click this button, you won't get it. So you have to click that button. Let me know if you have any problems. And has just chatted it out to everyone. Okay. We're digging right in because it's Tutorial Tuesdays. And once we got the chit chat out of the way, we dive right in. So how do we fill this in? It's called the hard thing template. It is for problem aware leads. We're going to start with the subject line. We do not always start with the subject line, but in this case, we're starting with the subject line. The subject line that you're going to fill in is how do you, and then this is the question. So there will be a question mark at the end of it. How do you, and then whatever your features or your product's value prop is in very short form. So your value prop is also a thing that they want to do. And I'll show you an example of this right away so that you can fill it in. But keep in mind that this is intentionally an open-ended question. We want them to be curious about the answer to it. And this question should make them go, I don't really know how I do X. That's exactly what I'm struggling with. So that's what you're going to want to fill in. Here's what it looks like in the email. It's really, again, you don't have to overthink this. You don't have to get crazy with this. This is draft one. You can always change the language later to make it more powerful and work better in an inbox. But this is something that leads for this particular solution would be thinking about. So you want to sub in something that your leads would be thinking about, and it should be your value prop. Get Prime measures engineers. That's what the tool itself, the solution, the platform did. Now it's called Flow by Pluralsight, and it does the same thing over there. So how do you, and then the value prop. The value prop here, measure and engineer. That's it. So you want to take a second. I'm going to take a sip of water. I really want you to go start filling in that template for whatever that thing is that you're trying to sell. If it's nurturing your own leads, maybe you're a freelance copywriter, and you don't have a lead nurturing sequence in place, go ahead and fill this in now. And just chatted out the link again. If you're late to arrive, go ahead and click that and then make a copy of it. I'm going to take a sip of water and then we're going to dive right back in. If you fill this in for yourself and you decide you want to chat it out to the group, show them what you've done, doable, awesome, cool. We're moving on. All right, this is a reminder. If you're new here, here it is. It's Bitly. Bitlys are always case sensitive, so keep that in mind. Lead-nurture-email. That will get you to today's template. Okay, next up on this, we're going to do these two headlines. You'll see in there, there's an H1 and an H2. They're really simple. Again, don't overthink this. That's the thing about templates. Where it's just really straightforward, just do the thing it tells you to do. You can always optimize later. So write the H1, it will build on the subject line. So if your question is, how do you measure an engineer? Then H1 for that would be like still, and then a bad way of measuring an engineer. So you'd want to sub that in there, still blank, and that's still a question mark as well. The H2 actually answers the H1. Actually answers the subject line. The subject line is how do you blank? Then your H2 answers it. Let me show you what that means, and then you're going to go forward and do it. So the subject line is how do you measure an engineer? You can see that up at the top here. The H2 is down below. Start by measuring churn. How do you measure an engineer? Start by measuring churn. Make sure if you've done this subject line correctly, then you should be able to say start by blank or whatever this thing is. How do you blank? Start by blank. Cool. And then you go and you do the H1 as well to make sure it's building on how do you measure an engineer. So how do you measure an engineer is because it's a value prop and it's in a subject line, it's not very specific. It's going to get them like, I don't know, how do you measure an engineer? And then you want to give them a specific example of the wrong way to do that thing. So how do you blank? Then your H1 is the wrong way to do that thing. That's it. And then make sure your H2 answers the subject line. I'm going to pause here. Go ahead, do it again for your own business, for a client's business, whatever else. And while that happens, Nicholas said, you mentioned this is a weird email for a services company. Do you suggest an entirely different template or just a different type of ending for this template? No, I don't remember saying it's a weird email for a services company, but services companies don't typically think of having features. And because this is trying to get you to a form of like early product awareness where you're now aware of a feature, unless the product is very small, then you might just be like more aware of the product itself by the end of this. So I recommend that you try this. Always try the thing until you find that it doesn't work for you, and know that it probably still will work for you. We've used this template many times. We've reverse engineered it, reused it across different things, and we haven't broken it yet. So just focus on just doing it and then modify if you need to. Lynn, I'm not sure why you're getting that. If you're copying and pasting the URL correctly and then selecting make a copy, it should all be good in the hood. All right. So you've now done the subject line. You've done the H1 and the H2. They don't have to be formatted as H1s and H2s in your version, but they are good for filling this template in to tell where the breaks are. So when do we actually get into the answer to the question that these people have? Cool. So let's move on now. We're going to not write the top of it. I almost never recommend you start at the top. We want to know where we're going, right? So we want to go and write the part that we're trying to get them to. That is early product awareness. So go below that H2 you just completed and fill in those parts. They explain the H2 and expand on it. Show how your solution does the H2, and then give any more specificity there to prove what you're saying. So any facts, any features, any details. If there's a GIF that shows actual evidence of what you just said, then put that in there. All we want to do at that point is remove ambiguity, right? So if you've said, here's how do you do this? Here's how you do this. Get into explaining how you do this, and then prove that this is how your solution does it well. That's what you want to do, and do it rapid fire, right? Do it pretty quickly. And the reason that we want to start at the bottom rather than starting with like, what's my hook? What's my hook? Instead of worrying about that, we want to just start at the place where we're trying to get to. So anytime you want to make something, you want to make a cake, you need to know what the final cake is going to look like. That's typically going to help you get there. When you're putting a puzzle together, having a picture of the puzzle and how it's supposed to look will typically help you figure out how to put the pieces together to get there. When you want to go somewhere, it helps to have a destination so you can like figure out the right route to get there. That's why we want to start at the end when we're writing emails. Not a lot of people teach this, but when you actually practice writing emails, when it's your job, this will help you keep from meandering through all the different ways you can try to get to the bottom. So fill that part in now. Let me show you what it looks like in the finished version. So the H2 was start by measuring churn. Great. Now we've answered the question that got them to open in the first place. Good. So that's also good for ensuring that they're more likely to click through because you haven't messed with them in any way. You haven't just been clickbaity. You haven't said one thing and done something else inside. You're actually giving them what they're looking for. If they open an email that says, how do you blank? That's an indication to you that they want an answer to that. And if your product can answer that, great. Here's the part where you talk about how your product can answer that. So in this case, the H2 was start by measuring churn. Then we define what churn is. Now, different people might not agree with this, but this is the definition of churn. And then we expand on that. So if you're measuring churn, here's what churn is. So whatever your answer is, expand on that in the next line, and then help the prospect understand more about it. So in this case, we say, hey, some churn is normal. That's why you can start by measuring churn. But if churn goes up dramatically for a particular team or engineer, it can indicate a problem. Then we switch over to introducing them to the product. You can identify this easily in Git Prime using the dev snapshot report. Then we put in a GIF of the dev snapshot report. Below that, we're now moving them more into that feature awareness so that they're becoming more product aware. That's all we want to do. Everything below the GIF is just proof of what we've said already. Here's what's going on. Here's how we solve that. Let me prove to you that we solve it. That's the part that you are filling in here. I'm going to give it a second. And Lynn got it figured out. Awesome, Lynn. Cool. While that happens, I'm just going to sit quietly. You fill that in, and then we'll come back. Okay, I didn't give you enough time. there's no question about it. The idea, ideally, is to finish a new email now, but more likely, you're just going to start putting things on the page. That's all we want to do, to show up ready to do things. Understanding that you'll probably have your own solution to write for, and if you don't, then you're just going to sit here learning, and that's cool. Just then go forward and do. Okay. Now we want to go back up to the top, and this is basically where we're finishing the first draft. You write the problem and agitation area. So all those things I told you, you'll need specific examples of how people are going about doing things. That's what you want to do now. So let me walk you through it so that you can go do it. They've just said at the top, okay, so here's my problem. Here's the way that it came to life. That's your H1. Like, this is an example of how this works. Now, given that they've signaled by opening this and by reading this email at all, they're currently doing the hard thing wrong. You want to hook them with empathy. Like, gotcha, I understand. You don't have to say I understand, but you're going to prove that in what you say. Then the line that follows is you've tried everything, and then you list the things that they've tried. So this is where the more you know about your prospect, the more VOC you've done, the more you've listened to what they do, the better you can fill that in, the faster you can fill that in. Then you want to swiftly summarize the difficulty of that hard thing and then move them toward a place where they're understanding, like, hey, they're not alone. Now, importantly here, we're going to move on quickly because it's a 20-minute tutorial. Importantly, you want to get specific. In your first draft, you're probably not going to be specific enough. So put things down here that you know you will go back to and improve the specificity of. You're going to need to keep building on that. So here's what that's going to look like when you do this. So still talking about lines of code in meetings. That's the wrong way to do the thing that the subject line was telling them about. Then we build on that. So outside of the engineering department, it's generally difficult for non-technical stakeholders to calculate your engineering team's velocity or productivity. So we're speaking to our lead is thinking, I need to measure engineers because when I'm in these meetings, my CEO is talking somehow about lines of code as if that's a way to measure my team. My CEO wants to measure my team the way that she or he can measure other people, like the sales team and things like that. So all we're really going to do here is build on explaining what their life is like, just holding a mirror up to them. That's where the problem and agitation part lives. Just hold it up and say, like, does your life look like this? And tell them that life. So the more you know about your prospect, the more this will look like their life. And the more they'll keep reading going, yeah, that's exactly right. This is hard. It sucks. So great. So that doesn't mean they don't try, is the equivalent of you've tried everything. Again, you can, this is the thing with templates, use what's there and then make it your own. So that doesn't mean they don't try. You've had discussions with non-engineers about time tracking, never fun. You've narrowly avoided arguments about whether counting lines of code is a measure of productivity. It's not, et cetera, et cetera. So this is us talking about like the real life, how people are trying to measure engineers and how that sucks. Then we move into helping them get toward this point. All we're trying to do now is get them to a place where they'll agree with us that they need to measure engineers. And here's a way that we suggest that they do it. And that's all these next lines are doing. So given that we have many questions and we're getting to the end of our time, the next thing you'll do when you go off and do this, and if you're watching the replay, awesome, pause these things, pause every time, and then go in and do that. But at this point, we want to go back, and the template explicitly calls not for you to enter something, but to do something here. Ensure you've answered the how that you set up in the subject line. SL means subject line. So whatever you said in that subject line, at this point, you go back over and read your whole email over to make sure that how do you measure and engineer is actually answered in here, which is what we've done. How do you, whatever you said here is actually answered in here, which is why, again, we want to use that how question out of the gate, because the whole email is there to answer that how. So we go back. If it's not clear, if you haven't explained that in a clear way, it probably means you don't have enough proof down here. So go ahead and add more in. You could possibly take a little more out of the top, but we're just trying to get to a place where we clearly answer that question so that we can then have a CTA in there that makes sense for their early product stage of awareness, which does mean that if they're not early product aware by this point, you need to work harder on this second half, the part that follows the H2. They should at this point know about at least one feature inside your product. They need to know that. If you haven't set a feature name at this point, it's not specific enough. No one's going to believe it. So you have to go in and make this about that feature. And again, feature in a service might be very different. It might be a person, it might be a process, it might be something else like that that they need to learn about in order to believe in your service. That is where we finish. In this case, for Get Prime, we had two CTAs at the bottom. One is the primary CTA, the second is a secondary CTA. So here's why churn is a metric to monitor. Great, we just sold them on how churn is supposed to be the thing, but we know our audience is very skeptical. So we're going to send them off to more content to help them understand why churn is a metric to monitor. It's good for continuing to nurture that lead. Or we're going to get them to book a demo to talk more about KPIs like this. That is all for the template. Then you want to let it sit. Always, always, always let it sit, and then you go back in and edit in the awesome. That's the whole job. That's the whole template. That is all for today's Tutorial Tuesday. Thank you everybody for showing up, hanging on, and hopefully you can use that template as many times as you need to across different nurturing sequences for yourself, for your clients, for your company, whatever. We will see you in our next Tutorial Tuesday next week. When is Andrew coming in? Ange?
Next week.
It is next week. Yeah. Andrew's in next week. All right. So we will see you there. And in the meantime, have a good rest of your week, everybody. Thanks, Ange. Thanks, y'all. Stay safe. Wear a mask. Bye.